Hi, everyone. This is America Adapts, the climate change podcast. Welcome back, everyone. On today's episode, I have Andy Revkin, legendary climate change reporter from the New York Times, now at Propublica. We'll be talking about reporting on climate change, the Trump presidency, the scientists' march on Washington, and much more. Please stick around. Hey everybody, this is your host, Doug Parsons. I hope you all had a great week. Last week we had Sean Martin on from the World Wildlife Fund. Been hearing a lot of good feedback on that. Thanks again to Sean for joining us. As I had mentioned, what an incredible episode today. It's a very timely episode, and it was just a big thrill for me to talk to this person. Today we have Andy Revkin. I'm sure many of you know him as a longtime reporter and sort of the host of the .Earth blog at the New York Times. Andy has been doing climate change coverage since the 80s, and we talk a lot about that. And he has recently, in the last actually few months, have moved to a new publication. It's called Propublica, and they're doing a lot more investigative journalism, and that is what Andy is going to be focusing on, although he still does kind of daily, timely pieces, and he's done actually quite a bit in the last couple of weeks. But we're going to talk about his move and what that means and what he hopes to cover. I mean, we cover a ton of topics, and I hope you stick around and listen to it. We talk about his early career, and then we spend quite a bit of time talking about what it means to be a journalist covering this new Trump administration. Obviously, it's been a very tumultuous first couple of weeks, and reporters have been keeping really busy, and climate change has come up quite a bit. And I talked to Andy about how he's covering it, how other reporters should cover it. Really is an interesting conversation. We also talk about the upcoming scientists' march on Washington, and Andy has some, I think, very interesting, provocative thoughts on that, and we go into the value of messaging and things like that. And so it's really an interesting conversation for me. I learned a ton. Also, after Andy, I have a short conversation with Tristan Corden. And folks remember, Tristan was an earlier guest. He was the reporter out of Florida who did the big story about the Florida governor banning climate change. We did a whole episode on that. So I invited Tristan back on just to have a conversation about his experience dealing with a hostile government, and that means like information sharing. And so he, again, really quickly goes over some advice to listeners on, if you are in government or whatever, if you're thinking about, needing to engage with reporters, he gives you some advice, nothing to get you into trouble or anything, but this is out there wanting to encourage sharing information with the public that the public deserves and is entitled to know. And so Tristan has a lot of experience with that, and he gives some pointers on those things and some contact information. Also, some housekeeping here. Don't forget to visit the website. If you're new to this podcast, I have a sister website, americaadapts.org. There's information on me. There's information on all the previous podcast guests. I've had 25 on now. There's quite a library there. I hope you go and have a listen, take a look around. The best way, if you're interested in this topic, is to subscribe to it on iTunes. Just go on your app on your smartphone and search in your app for America Adapts, and please subscribe. And please, if you are a regular listener, I'm going to do this every week. Take the time to go and write a review, please. It helps with the search on iTunes. It kind of makes it show front and center. So please, if you've listened to more than a few episodes and you enjoy them, make that effort. I really appreciate it. And for Android users, I think you can use Google Play or Stitcher, and I think there's similar ways of doing it. I have a Facebook page and a Facebook community group page. In the community group page, I have more of a one-on-one conversation with people who've joined that group. It's smaller than the Facebook page. If you are interested in joining that community group, people post stories there. I kind of give you updates on what's going with the podcast, and I generally answer pretty much anything that you post there. So just look up America Adapts on Facebook, and it should pop up. Please go subscribe to it, and I will approve you. Also, a shout out to a few people this past week for sharing information or just for contacting me. Doug Hanner, Rebecca Esselman, thanks for sharing some great resources. I always hear every week from someone new or two, and it really just makes my day. And Carrie White, thank you for reaching out with some good ideas. Also, this is very important. I am pretty much doing this podcast full time now. It's a new thing for me. I've really been enjoying it. It's been turned into a lot more than I thought it ever would. And the guests that are coming on are blowing my mind. We're having some, I think, really deep, substantive conversations, and the feedback that I'm hearing, it is providing a real resource for you. And so right now, how podcasts work, you count on supporters to support you. I'm looking at doing a Patreon page relatively soon, but if you could go onto the website and, for the price of a cup of coffee a month or something like that, anything would be appreciated, getting more listeners each week. But please consider doing this. I like to think even with this pivot to what's happening right now, that this is really useful information. So that's on the website, americadaps.org. And also, just for next week's guest, I have sort of a secret guest. I don't really want to reveal it right now, but I think it's very relevant and timely to what's going on. And then after that, the week after, I have Dr. Karen Poulter. And some of you are probably saying, weren't you supposed to have Karen on this week? I had to reshuffle a few things. Mainly, I want it to be more timely with kind of what's going on in the news. And, podcasts generally aren't that timely, but I felt like it was important to kind of shuffle things around. Karen's podcast was amazing, really incredible, useful information on sea level rise, but I'm putting that off by a couple weeks. And so stay tuned, subscribe, and you'll be able to stick around and hear these things. So, all right, this is the part where everyone's just like, shut up. Just let's get to Andy. Okay, I'm going to shut up now. All right, thanks for joining in. Bye. Welcome back, everybody. This is America Daps, the climate change podcast. I'm your host, Doug Parsons. I have a really special guest on today. It is Andy Revkin, science writer at Propublica. And so, Andy, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
So I was going to talk a little bit about your bio, but then I got really intimidated by that, and it was just going to be too hard because there are Revkin eras in climate change journalism. So I thought I was going to put it on you if you had to just kind of briefly describe who is Andy Revkin.
Well, I started writing about climate, the human relationship to climate in 1984, resulting in a piece in early 1985. It was on the cover of a magazine that doesn't exist anymore, Science Digest. But that was a place where some really great science writers cut their teeth, not including me, other people, Jeff Kluger, Tom Yulesman, Paul Hoffman, and more, Michael Lemonick. At any rate, that piece, it was on nuclear winter. It was the Cold War, and there was this idea that if we burned enough cities, it would cool the planet and wreck life as we know it. Then kind of became nuclear autumn, which didn't have as good a headline to it,
Right.
But more science. And that was interesting. More science was done, and it got more subtle. It's not like sometimes people think more science makes everything simpler, but not always. But part of that reporting was about climate models. And in fact, that piece mentions global warming because I went to the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Colorado that year to do the reporting for that piece. And the models were already being run to study global warming, which had been, as everyone on this pod listening, I'm sure knows, this is a 100-year-old idea, more than 100 years old. It's built, the science is built around the basics for generations, and had actually made it to Lyndon Baines Johnson's desk in 1965, and so the global warming story was there, and I was like, that's interesting. And then 1988 was the first really big news story about global warming. Yellowstone was on fire. There was hot summer in the United States and Europe, drought, and Jim Hansen testified, and we were off and running. And then I kind of never got off the bus, basically. I've reported on it in every medium I can think of. My first podcast on climate change, I've forgotten about it, but it was in 2005 from the Montreal Climate Talks. I did a podcast. People can find it online if you Google for Revkin podcast Montreal 2005 NY Times. So it's like, and then, and I've done every kind of aspect of it. The policy, the science, North Pole, the Amazon, the Vatican, the White House. And here I am at Propublica returning to full-time journalism. I'd kind of taken a break doing the blog.earth at the Times, on a freelance basis, which was not just about climate, it was about sustainability more generally, teaching through those 6 years at Pace University. And then they floated this job, announced a job at Propublica, it's kind of like the special operations part of an army without the army. Everyone in this newsroom of 65 or so people, which is expanding now, is super talented. I'm like completely humbled by the people around me. And it's deep digging kind of journalism that's in an endangered species in many other places. So that's kind of me.
I'm not even that young, and I've grown up with you. I've been reading climate change for a long time, and you've been so associated with the New York Times with climate change. And so I'm just curious for you. You've made this move to ProPublica, and it's only been a couple months. And so how does it feel to kind of make I mean, you would agree your sort of identity was wrapped up in the New York Times. It's just there was Annie Revkin at the New York Times, and then there was .earth, and so it must be a bit different for you.
Oh yeah, it's very different, and it's a place that if you're not using search to look at for a story, you didn't know about it or didn't follow me on social media, you would probably never see what I'm writing right now. It's different than the Times. Even my blog at the Times.earth was not particularly visible, but it was, it is the Times. It's the New York effing Times. People call you back and all that stuff. So it's different, but ProPublica is interesting. I just started, so I had I've just been doing 5 or 6 short pieces, not the kind of thing I'll be doing in the long haul, but for the longer, bigger efforts there, increasingly they are partnering with, they partner with Frontline, the TV program. They partnered with NPR. They partnered with National Geographic right now. There's a really good package coming with other magazines. So it's those partnerships that are kind of neat. And everyone should know, one thing I didn't know was, if you go to the ProPublica.org website, you'll see there's this thing that says steal our stories. They encourage reposting and republication of these pieces. So the material can move everywhere. And some of my pieces in recent weeks have already been in Scientific American, for example. So that's cool too.
Well, I'd be perfectly honest, I wasn't familiar with it at all until you made your move there, and I've obviously been doing my homework and digging around. And, what sort of stands out right now is I wonder that growth that you're talking about. I wonder if President Trump represents a new growth opportunity for a lot of journalism outfits, but their front and center is, if you have information or what's it even called? Sort of like if you want an anonymous poster or something, just contact this email. I mean, so you're
yeah, there's a secure data drop area. There's a secure, we all have Signal, which is this interesting app for your phone. So it's completely decryption. It's completely encrypted in a way that if the other person on the other end of the line is using it, no one can get that information. Already it's been useful because a number of people at government agencies who are fearful to talk on the record, and they're also concerned that they could be identified, through an email string or something. So they're using this as well. Signal.
So I just assume in the past week, last 7 days, there's been a huge pulse in the use of that resource.
I would imagine so. Yeah. And right now it's uncertain. Now, I did this piece a couple of days ago where I did note that the Obama administration was pretty infamous among journalists for secrecy, especially at the EPA. In the other way, they completely controlled access to EPA staff and scientists. And 2013, the Society of Environmental Journalists put out a report deeply critical of. They're saying at that time, at least, it was like this new pinnacle of privacy, of secrecy in government that they were. The SEJ was decrying. So, these issues can percolate from different vantage points, liberal, conservative, whatever. But right now, clearly, there's a lot of concern about, just a piece I did earlier, a few days ago. Someone at the EPA said, that people around her are coming to work in tears, routinely every morning because they're they're caught between, their desire for job security, they have families, whatever, and their passion for the issues they work on. So it's like those stresses, we'll see what happens in the weeks ahead. At EPA, there's signs, of course, this was even during the campaign, that there'll be a big crunch in the budget and a lot of initiatives will go away. And that means people will either be reassigned or eventually lose their jobs. So that's pretty much a given.
Well, I was just at this National Council on Science and the Environment conference, and Newt Gingrich spoke there, but I was able to talk to an EPA person. And I think most of the staffers, they just don't have any clue of what's going on. This woman was pretty honest. She's like, yeah, we haven't seen anything. There wasn't any emails, and they're just kind of, they get their information from news media. So they're still figuring it out. Yeah.
And frankly, we in the media, myself included, so far most of what we've written is, there's a certain element of speculation in it. It's really hard to know. Transitions in government are always turbulent, and administrations always say, stop putting out information until we start to vet it, because once you're president, there is latitude, as long as it's not lying, to change the flow of information that governments put out. I did a lot of investigative reporting in the early and mid Bush administration, sort of the first term and this part of the second term, and before President Bush, George W., fully embraced climate change. There was a lot of stuff going on that was, changing the flow, cutting down, rewording government science reports. But it was kind of like weirdly, it was within the range of the uncertainty in the science. Like it's so amazing what you can do with changing stress or adding words and stay within the sort of the boundaries of what's legitimate, but completely change meaning. That kind of stuff happened a lot. Jack Marburger, who was the science advisor for Bush, who was a Democrat before he took office, took that position. I interviewed him in 2003, piece, Bush versus the laureates. People can find it that way. And he said, look, this administration has a different view of things. They like a smaller government role, and they have latitude. They have discretion to change what government says. Right now, I'm talking to people, lawyers who are eagerly looking to see what laws could be applied that might a heavy-handed Trump shift of web content and stuff might violate. The Information Quality Act is one. So we'll see what happens going forward. But unfortunately, the language around science is pretty malleable in a way that can suit you. Like, I'll just give you an example. When I talk to environmental economists, they always say it's the uncertainty in climate science that's the reason to act. And they point to long, deep volumes of published work that demonstrate that. So the uncertainty is the reason to act, not but then you hear Scott Pruitt on the stand of the hearings, and he says, "Oh yeah, climate change is real, but we're still learning, and uncertainty is the reason to study more." And you could say what is that? It's different. It's spin, and it shows you that science is sort of like putty in a way, unfortunately, in the policy arena.
You've covered climate change for so long, and it's sort of an understatement that sometimes you're attacked from both sides on the issue. And you've shared some amazing material with me. I read that essay of yours, and I'm going to have these on my show notes. I don't necessarily want to dig too much into that, but for people that want to dig further, it was really helpful. But I'm just curious that this first week, it's like, okay, a lot of really big things happen, but I think you've had an ability to kind of step back and say, let's take a deep breath. It's not as bad as we think, or I don't know if I'm putting words in your mouth, but I think you know where I'm going with this. And I'm just curious if just even your exposure to what's going on so far, what would your advice be, or what would your observations be so far? Well,
usually what I've said is take a deep breath and look at the bigger picture, which is different than it's not so bad. In fact, the first long piece I just did for Propublica a few weeks ago, shortly after the election, was basically made the observation, which is grounded in data, that the global warming problem is actually too big for Trump to do much about. It's like he can't make it worse. And just as Obama couldn't really make it better, the reduction in American emissions under Obama was largely the result of trends in energy and the economy that were already well underway, that weren't his doing. And so he kind of lucked out, in that sense. But there's a lot of evidence that Trump, whether you look at, we're not going to suddenly, Trump can't order West Virginia miners to go back into the mines. He can make campaign pledges about bringing back jobs, but it's not going to happen because natural gas is abundant. It's pretty clear it's robustly abundant. I did a piece last year when the Department of Energy and its regular Energy Information Administration reports, there was a tiny little reference that said unconventional gas, meaning fracking, frack gas, is no longer unconventional, basically. It's now the convention. It's the dominant form of gas coming into our stoves and heating systems and factories. and power plants. So that the end of coal in America is pretty much a done deal, and Trump can't force that to change. So, and then most of the growth in emissions is going to be overseas. And there are some things he could do to undermine the Paris Agreement. But most of the Paris parties have already stated they don't plan to sort of shift gears based on him. And as I wrote in that piece, climate change 20 years ago was still kind of this disposable side issue. But now, for all these big countries, you'll see in May, there's the group of 8 and the group of 20. It's like Davos, whatever, these big fancy meetings of big powerful countries. Climate change is now on a par with trade and the other keystone issues, security. So it's not so Trump can't just go in there and be a bully. He's got to play or not. We'll see what happens, but it's not like he can just sort of set it to the side and say, that one we're not going to work on.
Well, climate change, especially the science, is still a pretty controversial issue for some, but I was getting the impression, and after 8 years of President Obama, that the worst was sort of behind us. And, I had Michael Mann on the podcast, and I sort of brought that up with him, too, because he went through his own battles associated with being attacked. But, I'm curious what your opinion is. Did you feel like there was a sense that, okay, the worst of having to convince people that climate science is legit was behind us, or could we just be the start of the beginning of that?
Well, it's, unfortunately, it's harder than that. A lot of my good friends in the media and in sort of academia, where I was at Pace University, and in positions of activism, still have this feeling that if people in the country get the basic science, meaning global warming is happening and we're contributing to it through the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, that's job done. That's oversimplifying things. I doubt anyone really thinks that that's job done, but that's just where things begin. It's the issues are how serious a risk is it to our future? And then the question is, who is the we? Who is the our? Is it just the United States, or is it everybody on the planet? And unfortunately, people tend not to think of still globally. When we think about we, most of us think about our community, our family, or maybe our town, maybe our state, maybe our country, but almost never the planet. And what do you do about it is you got some people who are very well-meaning who think that rapid deployment of nuclear is really the only way forward. And Jim Hansen, one of the, keystone climate scientists of our time, who's chained himself to fences with Bill McKibben at the White House. Jim he's written pretty disparagingly about renewable energy as being ramp upable quick enough, and he says it's got to be nuclear. He has his vision of a carbon price, and then there are people who called him, as this happened last year. He was actually labeled a denialist by another well-meaning scientist in the Guardian column for mentioning nuclear, and so so this just tells me that there's a long path forward in which the climate science can actually, here's what makes it even more interesting. It can actually be a distraction. One of the most interesting pieces of journalism I've seen, probably maybe the best in the last year and a half, was by John Sutter, who's a young video journalist at CNN. He did this 2 Degrees series going around the world ahead of Paris. Mm-hmm. He went to this town in Oklahoma, to a county, Woodward County, Oklahoma, which is the Yale survey identified as the most skeptical county in America on global warming. Okay. And it's a 3-minute video that is so worth anyone watching, where the first minute and a half, you see old people, young people, they're talking about climate. And this lady who looks she could be a librarian, she goes, well, out here, Al Gore's name is a cuss word. And then this guy who owns an oil company, such a small oil company, he says, we feel God controls the environment. So, you're watching this, I watch this as a liberal Easterner, and I go, oh my God, we're doomed. You know what I mean?
Right.
But then a minute and a half in, they start talking about energy, and it turns out that the oil guy, the God controls the climate guy, he says, half of our roof is covered in solar panels, and we want to do the whole thing because we want to get off the grid entirely. So here's and by the way, of course, his reasoning comes from his roots and his culture. And he's a libertarian, hardcore libertarian. I guarantee you he did not vote for Hillary. But I guarantee you he doesn't like big companies controlling his life. So he doesn't like utilities. He doesn't like, top-down government. But if you went into that town and you said, hey, everybody, you got to accept global warming science before I'll take you seriously, then you're missing this huge opportunity over clean energy that is lying right there that would just be destroyed by going in there revved up for a debate. Or, oh yeah, let's do a documentary on sea ice in the Arctic. Or that one of those things would somehow magically sort of tip the balance toward some common view of global warming. That expectation went away when I started looking at this science, which I feel is easily as important to understand if you want to stay sane in this arena.
I've been having some conversations with Randy about this. We're sort of this in a post-factual universe, and you talked about, even debating the issue of climate science. And to me, it's almost a battle you're never going to win. I mean, and you look at sort of what Donald Trump has done, the whole idea of crowd size. Here it is. We have photographic evidence, and there's people that are going to go along with him and believe him. And so you, as a journalist in that sort of search for the truth, how do you adjust to this? I mean, do you have to adjust? I mean,
it just reinforces to me the importance of understanding the science of, there's a guy at Yale, another group there, Dan Kahane, who he studies what he calls cultural cognition, which is most of the time when you think you're thinking, you're actually feeling, and most of your feelings are a result of your culture, your tribal identity, not your level of literacy or anything else. And so then knowing that and also knowing how social media work, getting familiar with that these tools can work against, common sense approach to life it's like taking a really cold shower and then whipping yourself with some rough branches, but it's necessary. It's like, and then you can start to say, well, okay, what do we do? How do we work with this? Whether you're an activist or a journalist or, whatever your role in this arena, or a scientist, I think, a lot of scientists, haven't learned those lessons I feel I learned about that just battering people with science or calling them a denier is the way forward. And I think you get at least finding, I think everyone, I'm not a fan of top-down control, but it would be great if everyone would watch John Sutter's Woodward, Oklahoma 3-minute video, and then say, okay, how can I work with that?
Well, so what do you think? What's your opinion? Now, of course, on paper, I'm supportive, but there's this new march for scientists that's going to occur in DC. I think it's in April or May. Do you think the messaging that's going to come out of that is going to be helpful?
No.
Okay. Don't sugarcoat it.
I'm just going by what I've learned. I'm not saying don't go, and I'm not, my wife went to the Women's March. But logistically, it's hard to see, it's hard to understand how that could help. And here, getting at this, I've been digging in a little bit on the attitudes among this. Remember, one thing that's important, by the way, is to keep track of, is that this was a razor thin margin in this election, that there was brilliance in the campaign that Trump waged in the closing weeks related to, where there were these close margins, where to do what. There's a great piece that someone wrote, I can't remember where it was, a big magazine piece on how this played out. And so it's not like there's some giant constituency out there that you have to defeat by having a march, but there is a part of America that resents the idea, and this came out if anyone watched the Pruitt hearings, the EPA confirmation hearings. There's this idea, waters of the United States, which is this expanded EPA authority over standing bodies of water near a big waterway. Mm-hmm. So like near a lake, a ship can go on, like the Great Lakes. If you had a farm field with a gravel path that gets a puddle in it sometimes, that's part of the waters of the United States. And that feels to a lot of people like an invasion. It's this, it's sort of the invasion of the wonks. How does that puddle effect, register under the Clean Water Act, which is supposed to be for navigable waters? And so marches are great, but I guess you got to say, well, what's the end result here? What's the goal I have? Is it to build my small constituency to be a little larger, or is it to tip American understanding in a different way? I mean, you think about this, like, what's the statistic? It's like 4 out of 5 Americans don't know a scientist.
Wow.
I mean, so rather than going to a march in Washington, it might be interesting to go to like your local town meeting and many people do. I'm not saying that people who aren't going to the march in Washington don't also do that. Or hold a little session at your local library, or, go to the local church and, say, hey, I'd like to, do a talk, and go to a farm, go to a place where, become part of a community that way, and in a listening way as well. One thing I've learned also over a long time is kind of, the value of listening and making sure you understand. And those things, don't come through mass action. Now, as I said, mass action has value and importance, but a strategic way of exploring what to do and how is useful, I think.
Well, I live here in DC, and I took my 8-year-old son to the Women's March last weekend. And, the idea of a broader message, I think, sort of is awash. And I think that might be the same thing with the Scientist March. But what I got out of it is sort of like, okay, look at all these like-minded people, and they just needed kind of a reboot. They can do something. There was probably a lot of despondency out there.
I've done this podcast now with Eric Holthaus, and the meteorologist who's become a very prominent popular climate blog writer, and with Jacqueline Gill, a great young paleoecologist at the University of Maine, focused on paleoclimate and climate change. And we did a session. We did in December, well, shortly after the election, we did this one episode of the podcast, which is called Our Warm Regards, that focused on the need for, a group hug. This is a tough time. It's a tough time. So validating one's identity is important. I mean, when I said it's not useful to do the march, I'm not saying don't do it. I don't want people to think I'm a chiding kind of person here. We need variety. We need diversity of approaches, activism, pragmatism, meta-analysis. We need all that stuff is necessary, but utility is something I have to consider in terms of like what I'm going to write about or think about in myself too, in terms of, the work I'm going to be doing at Propublica going forward.
So while I still have you on, you just transitioned to it. So you are a podcaster too, and you'd mentioned your podcast with the two co-hosts, and Eric Althaus and Catherine Gill.
Jacqueline Gill.
Jacqueline Gill, and it's called Warm Regards. And I haven't listened to every episode, but I listened to it. And I did listen to the one post-election. And again, that was my point of sort of like, your co-hosts obviously we're very concerned for real reasons, but then you came on and I felt like it was a much different tone. So it was interesting sort of seeing the three different voices associated with like the sort of post-election analysis. So.
Well, and I think that reinforces this idea of like dialogue, listening, thinking, communicating. We have very different views on some things. But if we don't talk to each other, that's not going to really move the world forward. There's so many like-minded people in this arena who don't talk to each other and who sometimes it seems like spend too much time sniping at other like-minded people, meaning people who want a sustainable human relationship with the climate, as opposed to doing work and, finding out where there really are actionable buttons to poke at and that kind of thing.
I also would like your advice too. So I don't know how much you know about this podcast at all. So it's America Adapts. And so my emphasis really has been about adapting to climate change and not the climate science. So, and just curious of like the sort of writing that you've done. And what's really been encouraging to me is like, the random listeners that you pick up. These are not scientists. They're not planners. I mean, I've had a bus driver like listen to the show. And to me, I naively think that the whole adaptation side of climate change is such a more proactive kind of narrative. And it must be so much tougher on the mitigation side because it's like change your light bulb or these big tough decisions about what you can't do. And I'm just curious your thoughts about it because I feel like there's an opportunity on the adaptation side. Eventually mitigation comes under adaptation, but I've been lucky to sort of talk about these feel-good stories of people adapting to climate change, that they're doing things now, being proactive.
adaptation, which is really important. So, well, one of the other realizations I think that's vital in really confronting the climate problem for what it is that there are huge opportunities right now to greatly reduce vulnerability to the hazards the climate system has within it. And see, what I just said to you is very different than saying we need to fight global warming, because in many cases you could end up in a waste of time kind of argument about, well, is this global warming making this thing happen? Wildfires, let's say, or coastal flooding, but that's completely it's almost so irrelevant because the vulnerability has been built mainly by other things we're doing. I'll give you an example. And one thing I do want to write about a lot in Propublica going forward is this question of where are there clear opportunities to reduce vulnerability to flooding, to drought and heat, to fire that are going begging because we don't want to deal with the actual drivers of those problems. Like in California and other parts of the West, the building boom that's happened in forest areas that are absolutely going to burn, that they're completely combustible, and there's very little disincentive to build there. And climate change is and is not a factor depending on which forest you're talking about and what the situation is. So why even, and here's what happens though, like Jerry Brown, governor of California, I would encourage listeners to look back or sift through his past speeches on global warming in relation on wildfires. And there are plenty of them, but they all focus on global warming. None of them has said, hey, we need to change how we build in fire zones. And that's this resilient, because politicians don't like to talk about limiting growth or saying what you can do at home. I mean, and I wrote about this in .earth just before I left there. There are communities and wealthy, rich communities in Southern California who were destroyed by wildfire, where imported palm trees planted on their property, which are unbelievably combustible. Anyone could just go on YouTube and search for flaming palm tree, and you'll see they're like bombs. They're like incendiary devices. So people then, their houses were lost. They got their insurance payoff. They rebuilt and they replanted the same palm trees. But no one talks about that. And this is these are the things you can do right now to reduce vulnerability to fire in these zones. Same thing with flooding. And once in a while we do the right thing. There was this bill that was passed inside and became law, the Biggert Waters bill, bipartisan, that basically said, federal flood insurance has been too cheap. So we're going to raise those rates. The program's going broke. And that was an unbelievable achievement. How did that happen? Because it's sensible if you're a libertarian, because libertarians hate governments paying people for stupid behavior. And it's terrible for anyone who's concerned about rising sea levels, because it's just going to get worse, right? So, but then what happened was it didn't matter whether they were Democrat or Republican. People suddenly saw their rates rising. They called their Congress people and it got rolled back. So, oh my God. So but it's great that you're focusing on this particularly, because it's another area where you can get overlap. Like just the fact that there was a bill passed that had, conservative and environmental support on flood insurance says it's possible to have action on this arena. It's kind of like what I was saying earlier about the guy with the solar panels in Oklahoma. On sort of smart energy choices and on resilient communities, you can build a conversation with people who will fight you to the death over global warming because it got so politicized. So hallelujah. Thank you for doing what you do.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that. And the federal agencies, if there's a big shift on climate change, when it comes to adaptation, they're just going to shift their language. It's going to be, disaster management or risk assessment. And, that's already happening to a certain extent, but, they'll still do adaptation, but they'll just have to bury climate change as a term related to it.
Yeah. Well, again, going forward, there are possibilities. I don't imagine that the Trump administration is going to roll back the, subsidies for solar and wind, because there are many Republicans who are very happy about that. And Rick Perry, I wrote this piece at Propublica recently where Hal Harvey, who's one of the most brilliant and passionate climate experts and wouldn't call him a campaigner, but yeah, he's pushing for action on climate change. And he said, Rick Perry is probably the best thing that's ever happened for wind. And he extolled him in this piece, because of when he was governor in Texas, there were lots of, progressive moves that facilitated building a grid that could incorporate a lot of wind. So, and Trump wants infrastructure. Well, the grid is infrastructure. So, but stay tuned, What do we know? It's really still too early to know what's going to come of this.
Just want to wrap this up with, if you could give me like 2 additional sort of things that you could mention. I ask all my guests if they could make a recommendation of a future potential guest. That would be greatly appreciated. And then I think you're a positive guy. If you're just leaving a positive message to listeners, and I don't know if in the context of like, what are the kind of things that we're reporting on, but people just are looking for what's ahead here. And I think people like you are just incredibly important to help provide that information to kind of figure out what's going on.
Well, you should get on John Sutter, the CNN guy.
Okay.
I think he really nailed something. You should talk to, there's so many usual suspects, but oh gosh. I would say Dan Kane. Dan is an interesting guy. He's hypervelocity. He might be hard to sort of rein in, but he would be fun for you to talk to. The guy at Yale who studies cultural cognition.
I've met him once. Yeah, he is a character.
Or take a road trip. Go to Woodward County yourself. That would be cool. I haven't been there yet. I want to see what's behind some of those sound bites. Although John Sutter, the guy at CNN, he did write a long, thorough post about it as well, with much more information about the people he talked to. So I would suggest him first. And then, in terms of optimism, and I wrote a long essay about reflecting on 30 years of climate learning and journalism. And one of the points I come to understand about this issue is, there's aspects of it that are just going to play out. I mean, one reason to focus on adaptation, by the way, is that, as you know, the climate system is so huge and has so much momentum. I recently there's a YouTube video. I interviewed a couple of guys at MIT about this, that it would take decades. It will take decades to have any kind of even remotely measurable change in climate trajectories that you could attribute to even a dramatic reduction in greenhouse gases. So that means we're in for impacts of today's vulnerability, the vulnerability built by us building in bad places or poor people who have no choice but to be in dangerous places in like sub-Saharan Africa. That has to be dealt with now. That's the now issue. And there, as I said, there's tons of exciting opportunities to do that. But in the grandest scale, the thing I've learned about the climate problem is it's so big and so multifaceted that everybody can play a role. The depressing thing is it's huge, but the engaging part of it is that if you're a teacher or an artist or a lawyer or a journalist, a podcaster or clearly a scientist or an innovator or a business owner, there's a role for you to play. That's part of this grand century scale effort to build a sustainable relationship with both energy and with the climate system.
Oh, I love that message. I think that'd be a subtitle. Everybody can play a role. Great final message. So, Andy, you, depending on how much you enjoyed this, you have an open invitation to come on the show anytime. Just from a previous life, I was a Fed working on climate change issues, and so I have a lot of federal government listeners, and partly what I want you on is that you're explaining that you're out there, and if they have scoops or things that they want to share, that hopefully that they would contact you. So, but maybe 3 months, maybe 6 months, if you're interested, I'd love to have you on again. So, hope that's an opportunity.
Sure. Great to hear from you. Keep doing what you're doing.
All right. Well, thanks. And, I will have a whole bunch of information on the show notes regarding what you do, warm regards and all that. But all right, everybody. Thanks for listening in. This is America Adapts, the climate change podcast. Hey, everybody. Welcome back. This is America Adapts. I'm your host, Doug Parsons. Back on the show today, Tristram Corton, a previous guest on the podcast. Hey, Tristram, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me back.
Yes, I invited you back for very specific reasons. We've had a week now with President Trump. So what are your thoughts, I guess? What's been this first week from a reporter's point of view?
I mean, from a reporter's point of view, it's sort of uncharted territory. It looks kind of fun out there, to be honest. Right. I mean, things are just sort of crazy. Yeah. And especially regarding, potential impacts to climate change policy and environmental policy.
and Tristan, when I contacted Tristan and for listeners, it's just, I thought it'd be useful. There's certainly a lot of, people in the public listen to this podcast, but we, have government employees, and a lot of them are in the federal government, and they're not quite sure what's happening now. And I've talked to these people in the last week, and I thought I'd get Tristan on. And if people recall, he broke that huge story out of Florida. Florida bans climate change, and it's probably just a major test run with what we're about to go. And so I just wanted to kind of get Tristan's advice on, if there are public servants out there, how they feel like they need to respond, or what are some resources, or just, your observations, Tristan, on kind of the way forward. And so I'm just going to throw some questions at you. And if you just have some insight on things, I think any of it's going to be useful, because like you said, some of this is uncharted territory. And I do think your experiences in Florida is just like this, on steroids.
Well, yes and no. It definitely is a larger version of what we had going on here. There are some key differences between the work I did in Florida and what's happening now. The main one is that what I uncovered when I was with the Florida Center for Investigative Reporting in Florida was a sort of secret government policy banning the terms climate change and global warming from being used in any official state correspondence. That's emails, reports, papers, etc. They were trying to keep it hidden. There was nothing outlining this policy, and they denied it when they were confronted with it, they being the governor and his affiliates. Today what's happening is that they're not denying it. They're just doing it out in the open. They're deleting Twitter accounts and removing mention of climate change, etc. So they're not worried about being discovered. And that changes the game considerably.
Well, isn't there a little nuance to it, though, that so they are being pretty blatant about removing these things, but, when you get into those situations where they're actually asking the spokespeople or whatever, they are still saying things like, no, we're not doing that, or there's nothing to it, or, we're reassessing things. And so there's still an element of that. They're not just coming out and saying, we're getting rid of all climate change stuff because we think it's bunk. There's that facade of like, oh, well, don't look too much into our actions.
Right. So my recommendation, I'm not primarily a government reporter, nor have I worked in DC, but my recommendation is, we're in this, we being journalists are in this for the long haul, ostensibly the next 4 years, unless lightning strikes, which in a increasingly destabilized environment might happen.
Yes.
I meant that metaphorically and literally, that not to overreact, I see a lot of Sturm und Drang up in DC, coming out of DC. And I just would, if you're a reporter, especially one who's concerned about the environment and covering it, to just buckle down and ask questions about the details. Stick to the specifics. One of them are, get a position on climate change. Are they disputing the climate change science? And if so, what evidence are they relying on to dispute that science? So what's the counter evidence that they're using? And what do they want these federal agencies to accomplish if they're going to divert funding and energy, figurative energy, away from studying climate change? What do they see as those resources would be better spent on? If you just focus on the detailed questions and not allowing yourself to get sucked into the outrage or the turmoil, eventually a clearer picture will emerge for the public, who is your ultimate, audience and who you ultimately answer to.
Well, I think maybe another difference here too is that, when you were on the podcast, you talked about how hard it was to get existing employees to kind of speak on the record. And yet it seems leaks are just coming from everywhere from the federal government now. And so that it's probably very helpful to a reporter is that you're getting all sorts of willing sources out there.
Yes, that's a huge help. It was interesting. One of the responses to the last podcast I did with you on that was a government employee saying, that's all in good to say, because I was bemoaning the fact that no state employees had the courage to come out. I had to sort of ferret this stuff out. And this person said, look, it's all in good to say, you should stand up for your principles, but we have jobs. We want to continue doing this work. And if we get into conflict with our managers, then we might not have a job to do this work, etc. So I am sensitive to that. The great thing today is that you can, anonymously, contact reporters, and even better, just give them the data. If you're going to be, so the danger for reporters using anonymous sources is that you don't know what their agenda is, and it just doesn't look like you're being transparent if you use them. So mainstream papers often try their best not to use anonymous sources. But data is data. If there's a report and you leak it to a reporter, and then the official version is different, say mentions of climate change have been deleted from the official version, but they're in this draft report, that's, valuable information that we can use to help assess what's going on. So I would encourage you to, yes, reach out with, in a responsible way, reach out anonymously there are plenty of anonymous drop boxes that media institutions have where you can put information in and you're protected. Don't do this from a work computer.
Right.
Or work site. And we want to have an informed public, and if the government's trying to cover information or misinform us, then you're doing a valuable and moral thing.
Well, and on that note, sort of the providing that anonymous information, I've been noticing like ProPublica and Washington Post have been seeing on social media of like, here are secure ways of leaking information. They have these new online resources of, I guess, hopefully not hack-proof ways of kind of sharing that. And so I'll certainly share those links out there. I think the newspapers are not waiting around. And like you said, there's a standard that, the bigger newspapers want to follow, but like we're in an uncharted territory now. And so they're going to want to get that information.
Yeah. I mean, it is uncharted territory. I really want to know, I'm always interested in what's informing your opposition to the science that tells us that the climate's been changing, and it's changing as a result of human activity. And I don't see for all the opposition, which is strong and entrenched in Washington, I don't see a lot of debate on it. I don't hear the other side saying, well, this is why you're wrong. There's lots of stuff out there claiming that this information is wrong, but I don't see these policymakers talking about it. I would press all these reporters and everybody to just, objectively keep asking those questions. You don't have to be confrontational, but you just don't take no for an answer and keep pushing. We never got the governor's response to this controversy here in Florida, and it still bugs me. He was asked several times. He said, it's not true. And that was it. And then they hoped the whole thing would go away. It didn't go away. And nor will this. And especially if we keep asking, well, okay, so, you removed the climate change web page on the EPA's website. I'm just throwing stuff out there. And why? Just to help us understand why you're doing that. You don't have to be accusational. Just help us get some answers.
Well, I think I want to have a future conversation, maybe after a few months of the Trump administration, but this whole notion of a post-factual universe and what it means for a journalist, which in theory, your role and responsibility is to get down to the truth. And if you have a sizable portion of the population who simply doesn't care that they're getting the truth, what does that mean to be a journalist? So, that's a bigger conversation.
That's a bigger conversation. Also, I think I just used the word accusational. I'm not sure that's a word. I want to go on the record disavowing it.
All right. Okay. You officially noted. And so I didn't want this to be a long piece, Tristan. I just want you to kind of get on, especially to give some advice to some listeners out there who are curious on how to do some of these things. But I'm curious, like with the situation in Florida, like you just said that the governor never really came out and sort of acknowledged this in a substantial way. And I see a potential silver lining, like in the state of Florida, all the stuff that's going on at the local government level on this state is not stop doing adaptation planning and all sorts of climate change work. And that's going to happen all over the country, no matter what Trump does, at least for the short term with the EPA. And so that to me, it's not the police state yet where they're stopping everybody from doing it.
Right. They can't. And the municipalities who are on the front lines of, making sure that sea level rise doesn't flood their streets and that, and planning for raising roadbeds, et cetera, et cetera. They're on the front lines of facing this problem. It would be a huge help if the federal government was on board and had been on board, and they could sort of bypass rogue states like Florida. But now, if you don't have cooperation from state agencies or federal agencies, there's a greater onus on the municipalities to deal with this alone.
Well, the universities will still be working on it, the city governments, and again, it's not the best situation, but people will continue to work. And so, Tristan, I guess on a final note, I think you're always looking for a great story out there, and I wonder, because you had mentioned that the governor hasn't acknowledged this, that I wonder if the people in the Trump administration would look to Florida as a model on how to kind of keep the lid on doing climate change work, and if there is any interactions, or there might be interactions in the future between Trump administration people and the state of Florida on how to do these things. And that, to me, if somehow that got out, that would be a great story. So I don't know ways to look for those kind of things.
That's a great idea. Governor Rick Scott is a Trump supporter. He was his campaign chairman or treasurer, at least for Florida. Yeah, I wonder about that. I guess thanks for the assignment. I'll get to work.
Well, especially if there's any Florida state employees or EPA employees listening, you get wind of those. Oh, well, how'd they do it in Florida? I don't have my encrypted link set up yet, but you can always reach me at tris.corton@gmail.com. tris.corton@gmail.com. I'd be interested to hear from you, and I will do everything in my power to protect anonymity and identifying details, etc. Yeah, and if you want another layer, if you don't want to go directly, like with your name or something, and you want to go with me, and then I forward on to Tristan, whatever works. Because if you have some information, we want to encourage that. And again, I like I've been saying, I don't want to encourage anybody doing anything, I guess, illegal, but people are going to have to stick their necks out, as you noted in the previous podcast, and we're as public servants, I hope you look at the broader public good. So, yeah. All right. Any final thoughts before, just a quick, come on. We could probably do this once a week, sort of an update, like, oh, okay, what's going on? But, any final thoughts? No, don't succumb to the craziness, and just steady as she goes, For the reporters, just get the details for us. We're dying to find out. And for the public employees who are of a mind, reach out to us. You're doing a public good. Thanks again, Tristan. Thank you. Good luck.
This country is safe again, Superman. Thanks to you.
No, sir. Don't thank me, Warden. We're all part of the same team. Night.
Yes, hopefully we'll remember that we're all on the same team. I love Andy's message that everyone can play a role when it comes to climate change. It's that big of an issue. So thanks again for joining in this week. Thanks to Andy Revkin, an amazing episode. Thanks to Tristan Corton for coming in. Don't forget that you can contact Tristan. I'll have that information on my show notes. Visit the website at americadaps.org, or subscribe on iTunes or on the Android apps that you use. So next week, again, I have a very special guest. I don't want to reveal right now, but it's very timely to what's going on. And don't forget to join the Facebook page and the community group page. And I hope everyone has a fantastic week. Thanks again. This is America Daps, the Climate Change Podcast.